Service dress was the new style of khaki uniform introduced by the British Army for use in the field from the early 1900s, following the experiences of a number of imperial wars and conflicts, including the Second Boer War. This variant of uniform continues to be worn today, although only in a formal role, as No.2 Pattern dress, khaki. In many of those conflicts, the bright red tunics worn by British infantry regiments had proved to be a liability, especially when faced by enemies armed with new rifles firing smokeless cartridges. The term khaki had come from India and was used to describe the drab uniform first worn in 1848 by the Corps of Guides, which had been raised in December 1846 as the brainchild of Sir Henry Lawrence, resident at Lahore, and agent to the Governor-General for the Northwest Frontier. Lawrence chose as its commandant Sir Harry Lumsden, supported by William Stephen Raikes Hodson as second-in-command, to begin the process of raising the Corps of Guides for frontier service from British Indian recruits at Peshawar. Initially, the border troops were dressed in the native costume, which consisted of a smock and white pajama trousers, made of a coarse homespun cotton, and a cotton turban, supplemented by a leather or padded cotton jacket for cold weather. For the first year, no attempt was made at uniformity. In 1848, Lumsden and Hodson decided to introduce a drab uniform, which Hodson commissioned his brother in England to send them, as recorded in Hodson's book of published letters, 12 Years of a Soldier's Life in India. It was only at the later date, when supplies of drab material was unavailable, did they improvise by dyeing material locally with a dye. During the Indian Mutiny of 1857, many British regiments took to staining the white tropical uniforms with tea leaves or other makeshift dyes in order to camouflage them. Rifle regiments had long used dark green uniforms as camouflage, and some units of the Volunteer Force London Regiment had adopted hodden grey uniforms for the same purpose. Numerous khaki uniforms were adopted by units in the field over the turn of the century, but the standardized service dress uniform was not adopted until after the Second Boer War. Service dress. Other ranks. For other ranks, the SD uniform originally comprised khaki wool trousers, a khaki wool tunic, with stand and fall collar, 4 pockets on the front, each buttoned closed by a flap with a straight edge, large, serge reinforcement patches over each shoulder straps, and a pair of brass wire hangers on the back, over the kidneys, to support the belt. The front of the jacket was closed by 5 buttons, usually of a regimental pattern, arranged vertically. A peaked cap was provided, covered in the same khaki serge, with a leather chin strap held at either side by brass or horn buttons. This uniform was worn with ankle ammunition boots. In the field, puttees would be wound up the length of the shins to the top of the boots. The carrying equipment worn with this uniform was normally the 1908 pattern webbing, made of fabric and also khaki. Officers. The officers' service dress was completely different, except in color. The cloth used was tailored and of more expensive wool, and the jacket had longer skirts. After 1913, the turned-down collar was replaced by open-stepped lapels, revealing a shirt collar and tie, rather similar to a civilian lounge suit. The breast pockets were pleated and closed by scalloped flaps, while those at the hips had straight edges. There was a shoulder strap on each shoulder, but rank was originally displayed on the cuffs, which were scalloped at the closure and edged with herringbone pattern khaki tape. trousers or breeches, often of a riding style, and brown leather riding boots were worn. The carrying equipment was the leather Sam Brown pattern, brown for most regiments, black for rifle regiments. Officers also wore a khaki peaked cap, and although similar to the men's with a cloth visor, was made of superior materials and was of better quality. Unlike other ranks, officers were expected to pay for their own uniforms, pistol, sword and Sam Brown belt. Scottish variations. Scottish Highland pattern uniforms differed in the wearing of tartan kilts or trousers, rather than trousers or breeches, and in alterations in the design of the tunic and jacket to make them resemble a traditional Highland doublet type, notably in cutting away the skirts at the front of the tunic to allow the wearing of a sporran. Most Scottish regiments did not wear the service dress peaked cap, but either the Glengarry or Tam O'Shanter. Tropical variation. There were also lightweight uniforms for wear in warmer climates, known as khaki drill. The officers' was little different in cut, but the other ranks' tunic was distinguished from the temperate service dress by having only the breast pockets. Both were made from a lighter cloth. Trousers were often replaced by Bermuda shorts. The same headdress was generally worn, however, if worn at all. Pith helmets, covered in khaki cloth, continued to be the norm in warm climates up to the Second World War. Royal Air Force. The Royal Air Force's service dress was adopted in the early 1920s and is of a similar design to the British Army service dress, but RAF service dress is of a blue-grey colour. The Great War. This was the standard combat uniform of the British Army at the start of the Great War and remained little changed throughout. A radical appearance of the service dress is demonstrated by accounts of German troops who, on first seeing British soldiers, thought that their clothing was more like a civilian golf outfit than a military uniform. With the numbers of uniforms produced, minor variations appeared, especially in the private soldier's hat and the shape of the tunic collar. A soft version of the peaked cap was introduced, nicknamed the Gorblimey. This was an attempt at conservation but had the advantage of being able to be stuffed into a pocket or even pressed underneath the new steel Brodie helmet, which came into service in 1916 as the realities of trench warfare and its attendant artillery bombardment set in. Although this was the standard combat uniform for the British Army and colonial units, the armies of the Commonwealth countries had variations on the theme. The Canadian tunic was closed by 7 buttons and had a conventional tunic collar, although the Canadian officers' service dress was the same as that in the British Army. The Australian version of service dress, brought into use in 1912 and called the Commonwealth pattern, differed significantly. It was a lighter pea-green color, had a voluminous pleat in the back, sewn-on waist belt, 4 large front pockets and triangular-shaped upper pocket flaps. Officers' SD uniforms were modified during the war, chiefly in that plain cuffs were introduced, with the rank insignia moved to the shoulder straps. The reason for this was that the old cuffs had made it too easy for enemy snipers to distinguish officers from men. Scottish Highland regiments replaced the sporran during the war, with a khaki cloth apron with a large buttoned pocket where the sporran would sit. Kachinas Blues. At the outbreak of war in 1914, the huge number of volunteers answering the appeal of Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener, were formed into a new army. The problem of providing uniforms for these recruits was acute, and many trained in the civilian clothes for weeks. A highly simplified version of service dress was produced for them, without breast pockets, shoulder straps and other refinements. They were dark blue in color, because the original khaki dye had been produced in Germany before the war and it had proved difficult to acquire sufficient from alternative sources. This color gave rise to the popular name for the uniform, Kachinas Blues. Around 500,000 sets of these uniforms were produced and worn during basic training. The Second World War. The service dress uniform continued to be the field uniform of the British Army until shortly before the Second World War, although many units continued to wear it after the start of hostilities and many Home Guard personnel wore it throughout the war. Service dress was officially replaced as the standard combat uniform of the British and Canadian armies in 1939. With the introduction of battle dress, service dress continued to be used by officers throughout the war, as a walking-out dress and for semi-formal functions. Senior officers might rarely be seen in any other uniform. The Sam Browne belt had been replaced as carrying equipment for officers by the 37 Pattern web equipment, but continued to be worn with the service dress, usually reduced to the belt and one brace, though a Frogger pistol holster might be added as needed. The Australian Army continued to wear its version of service dress as its standard combat uniform throughout the war. Current use. Since the Second World War, service dress has continued in use as an intermediary between combat uniforms and full dress. It is also referred to as No.2 dress. As worn today, the tunic has become a jacket with an opened collar for wear with collared shirt and tie and cap. Jacket and trousers are all made from a smoother cloth than the rough serge. In some regiments a beret is worn in place of the peaked cap. When battle dress was replaced with the green cotton 1960 pattern combat dress, it was used, for a time, for similar roles as the service dress. Men's stand and fall collars were replaced on BD blouses, also with open collars for use with shirts and ties. There was no need for two different uniforms for precisely the same occasion, however, and only service dress retained.